Good evening. Good evening, Rushali.
Good evening, ma'am.
Okay, let's begin with today's blog. This is blog 6, and we are going to start today with Canadian short story. It contains 4 units again, Unit 21 to Unit 24. And we'll gradually start with Unit 1, where we speak about short fiction in general and the Canadian short story. And then we proceed to Unit 22, 23, and conclude with 24. So let's begin with the Unit 21. This is about short fiction or story as a literary form. Now, it's about the Canadian short story. What we are going to talk about mostly will be literary form, short fiction as a literary form, main elements of a short story, the short story in Canada, and then conclusion, and then we come to discuss the important questions. So let's begin. Um, this is short fiction or story as a literary form. Now, throughout and powerful impulses of man have been to give an account of his experiences and to draw a moral from it. As a social animal, it was inevitable that these two impulses assert themselves for thus, even in the most primitive times, anecdotes of personal experiences. This began even before man had learned to write. It was a natural step when a clever and skillful man, due course of time, turned these experiences into very much more interesting and instructive stories on the way to their becoming literature. Sometimes these personal happenings were linked with mighty names like Solomon, Samson, Arthur, Ganesh, Narada, and the like to give these happenings historical or mythical importance. Now, gradually, by judicious selection and by skill and manipulation, man bloomed out to be a conscious artist and shaped and formed his material to provide thousands of these stories. There is an invaluable treasure contained in the myths, legends, folk tales, and fairy tales of all countries of the world. We have the Panchatantra and the tales of the Jatakas, stories from Ramayana and Mahabharata. Bards roamed about singing the glories of their gods and heroes of the Iliad, the Odyssey. The Middle East gave to the world the Arabian Nights, and Israel produced the Bible with its repository of great moral stories, and so on with many countries. Till Boccaccio of Italy succeeded in giving a clear setting and character to the short story in Decameron, followed by the Canterbury Tales of Chaucer in England. Now, only at the beginning of 19th, the short story as a distinct literary form began to attract attention of serious literary writers in lot numbers. Almost simultaneously in Germany, USA, Russia, and France, short stories began to appear, and um, and the uh, the earliest short stories writers like Kin, Washington, Poe and Hawthorne, Gogol, okay, Balzac. Now these writers were the earliest short story writers. There was a by W. Irving, which was named Rip Van Winkle, sorry, is often taken to be the short story in the modern sense of the term. Now, when we talk about the literary forms, the first thing which comes to our mind is, like say, short. the name short story, but the origin of which only came during 19th century, as is clear by the names with which the early writers called their words, like sketches, tales, and pictures, articles, etc. Now, why short story as a new form should have come as just this time is difficult to explain generally. Possibly, the short story could not develop until the novel itself had reached the status of serious art and some degree of maturity in the latter half of the 19th century. The widespread experimentation with new forms as part of the Romantic movement at the beginning of the 19th century may also be suggested as contributing factor. Evolution of popular magazines may also have largely contributed. In, like, for example, in America, the novel could not be published freely due to handicap of copyright of English writers and publishers. They were on a freer ground as far as the short story was concerned. Editors of magazines competed with each other to fill the pages of their magazines with stories, as the greatest blessings of the short story was that it was really short. Um, Edgar Allan Poe formulated the first set of principles for the art of the short story. A skillful literary artist has constructed a tale. If wise, he has not fashioned his thoughts to accommodate his incidents, but having conceived with deliberate care a certain unique or single effect to be wrought out, he then invents such incidents. He then combines such events as may best aid him in accomplishing the preconceived effect. Now, if this very initial sentence tend not to the outbringing of this effect, then he has failed his first step. In the whole composition, there should be no word written, of which the tendency, direct or indirect, is not to the one pre-established design. R.L. Stevenson felt the short story writer must have an impression or idea to communicate with which one should be able to engage his attention from the first to the last. We must see the end in the beginning. And if you talk about W.S. Morgham, he wrote, "A good short story is a piece of fiction dealing with a single incident, material or spiritual, that can be read at a sitting. It is original, it must have a unity of effect or impression, it should move in an even line from its exposition to its close. The language of the short story should be a model of economy. It requires the apt word and the telling phrase. The form of the short story does not allow stylistic elegance for its own sake. That the short story has changed is beyond doubt. It has become all sorts of things: situations, episodes, characterizations, and the narrative. In effect, a vehicle of every man's talent. From the didactic stories of Hawthorne and tales of terror of Poe to the scientific romance of H.G. Wells, the development is indeed exciting and marvelous. The serious short story of the 20th century might be visualized as developing in four directions. Native essay by W. Irving's The Legend of the Sleeping Hollow, narrative local history, Mark Twain stories, then prose drama, Hemingway's Killers, and lyric poem James Joyce The Dead. It has been in the 20th century, and the lyric and dramatic possibilities of short story have been explored. The similarities of short story to particularized history and expanded anecdote are traditional. The short story is different from a novel in ways. For example, it has a unity which is absolutely single and not multiple. A novel has a bigger canvas. It represents life in all its variety and complexity. A short story represents only a phase of life or a slice of life. A short story has only one plot and no subplot, and it has no superfluous characters and incidents. Without a plot, character, atmosphere, generally one thing predominates. It is not so in novel. The purpose of a short story is to intensify a small moment of life. Structurally, a short story must have a direct opening, a swift movement, a forceful climax, and a satisfying ending. Frank O'Connor finds the short story akin to Robert Browning's dramatic monologues, caught in a state of peculiar significance, because his frame of reference can never be the totality of human life. The short story writer must always be selecting the point at which he can approach it, and each selection he makes has the potential of either being a success or as well that of a complete fiasco. Now, moving to the next unit 121.2, here we discuss about the main elements of a short story. Now, if I may ask you, Roshali, can you just what convinces you that a short story is a satisfying one or a beautiful one?
Sorry, ma'am, I can't get what you said.
If you read stories, do you read short stories?
Yes,
Okay, so can you just what amuses you in a short story?
sorry,
What amuses you in a short story?
ma'am,
Which
you are not
yeah, tell
audible
me.
properly.
I'm not audible.
Yes, your voice is cutting in between.
Um, okay, am I audible now?
Yes,
Okay, so I was asking, so what do you like in a short story?
like it explains, the plot is really short, so it's very easy to comprehend.
Okay,
Yes, and in short
so
stories, you
hmm,
don't invest that much time, but it has good morals, which explains
okay,
in a briefly.
okay,
Like in
okay, I get.
Panchatantra, you have many short stories that
Mm-hmm.
I used to read earlier.
Okay. Okay, good, good, Rishali. Thank you for that answer. I appreciate it. So, right now we are actually going to cover all the elements that can make a short story more promising, and that has the capability to make a short story, like in the other words, having a swift movement or a direct opening or a forceful climax or a satisfying ending. So some stories are funny, some are interesting, some are sad. Overall they all carry some gems of wisdom with them, or definitely there is some kind of a moral attached. Mm, Now it's a fact that since childhood we had been all grown up surrounded by stories. There are stories from across the places that we have been staying, from the neighbors, from the places that we had been studying, environmental wise also there had been so many stories. Our grandparents have told us stories, but we have never ever taken time to understand or critically examine a story, and probably we have never looked at it very closely, because we never have found the meaning of doing it, because we have all heard or read stories for pleasure or maybe to receive some kind of a moral or what it actually wants to convey, but we have never critically examined a story. Whenever we read a piece of story or any kind of a literature, two things are basically important. First is what has been said in that book of literature or that piece of write up, and how it has been said. Now, what here refers to the theme or subject matter or the content of it, and how deals with the technique or the kind of the presentation or the delivery used to convey the particular theme or subject of it. Now, although there are modern short stories who defies definition, however, it is important to know to look at some of the basic elements of what makes a short story. Now, there are elements like plot. You just talked about it, because there is short story, so quick plot, and then that ends very soon. So plot is important. Then definitely some characters that surround the plot, that is important. How the content of the entire story has been delivered, that is important. That comes with the technique of narration. What is the tone of that entire writing, what is the theme, what exactly is the theme, what are some of the literary devices and languages which has been used, and the setting and the atmosphere. And this will probably be sufficing the main elements of the short story. So let's start first with the plot part. What is a plot? Would you want to answer, Rusali? What is a plot? Yes, Rusali. Would you like to answer, Rushali? What is a plot?
Ma'am, plot is what the story is, like what the content of the story is, what it is about.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The how the events and the happenings in the story are sequenced, isn't it? So you got it right. Yes, good, Rushali. So let's start with the plot. Now, when we talk about the plot, that is exactly the content that we are talking about. How the events or the happenings or the occurrences in the story are happening, when and how they are happening. So the organization, the arrangement, or the sequence of events and incidents in the literary work is called as a plot. Now, if you think about the word plot, there is a beautiful line by E.M. Forster. He had written aspects of the novel. He speaks about, we have defined a story as a narrative of events arranged in their time sequence. A plot is also a narrative of events, and the emphasis falling on causality. That means we focus here on what gives a reason for the next occurrence to happen, and likewise what would be the next happening, and likewise the emphasis is mostly on the causality, what causes another event to happen. So that is what E.M. Forster's in aspect of novel he talks about. The king died and the queen died is a story. For example, the king died and the queen died is actually a story. The king died and the queen died of grief is a plot. Can you understand? So, if there is a story, so the king died and the queen died, but the king died and the queen died of grief is a plot. That is a causality that E.M. Forster is talking about. The time sequence is preserved, but the sense of causality overshadows it all again. The queen died. No one knew why until it was discovered that it was a thorough grief at the death of the king. This is a plot, definitely, but what is involved here is the mystery, a form capable of higher development. You develop a mystery here along with the grief as a plot. It suspends the time sequence, it moves as far away from the story as its limitations will allow. So, a plot does not show merely what happens but also why something happens. The story writer may rearrange the sequence of the events in time. He may start the story in the middle, he may relate the end first, and then relate the rest of the events in a flashback. Generally, we might have seen movies also where a certain kind of a plot starts just like that, somewhere from the middle, and it takes us to a flashback, and then brings us back to the current situation. So, likewise, so the story writer has the liberty to rearrange the sequence of events in time. He may start the story from any part of the time and then relate the rest of the events in a flashback. He may give us partial information to some extent, so that this will sustain our interest, and dole out the rest of the information. So this depends on what exactly the story writer wants to grab the attention of the reader in that way. In short, it can be said that a plot is a design that an author imposes on a simple narrative account to give us pleasure and to signify meaning out of it. Now, plot is definitely linked with a character, or characters, as it is the actions of the characters that give movement to the plot. It is the characters who take the action forward and in the process reveal the various facets of mankind. Sometimes it can be their hopes, sometimes it can be their fears, sometimes their expectations, sometimes disappointments, their relation with other people, and reaction to situations. Henry James, if we talk about him, puts it likewise: what is character but the determination of incident? What is incident but the illustration of character? So, plot is first, and then is character in action. Another important aspect of a plot is unity. Each event should grow out of the previous one. There should be a link between events in a manner of cause and effect again, which should be governed by logic of both characters and events. Sometimes we see there is some illogical, any kind of an illogical thing in the book or in the movie. We don't really like it because we don't understand the cause and effect that it's trying to bring. So that's the reason why it has to be, any cause and effect has to be governed by logic. So this was all about plot. Now we move to character. Uh, Now, when we discuss about plot, we already know that characters are intrinsically woven around the character. You cannot think of a story without a character. Your story must have a properly worked out plot, that is for sure, but the evolution of a character is necessary. Um, the modern short story has turned away from plot and has become less complication resolved than situation revealed. Characters are those who participate in the action of the story. Readers reach out to characters more readily and derive pleasure and satisfaction from such association. Getting back to aspects of novel by E.M. Forster, um, he tells about a very useful classification of the characters, being two types. One is a flat kind of a character, one is a round kind of a character. The flat character is a static character, a very generalized stereotype character built around single idea or quality, who does not grow or any add any kind of a contribution to the development of the story. Now, such a character may be detailed in just an outline and may be described in a phrase or a sentence. A round character is a complex character here, who changes and develops, who evolves, who changes according to different situations and is not very easy to describe. He can reveal different traits at different times. And unlike a flat character, he's capable of surprising us, of course, because there will be so many different situations in his life. So accordingly, he will be showing his emotions, and he will be surprising us by the way he's treating the situations which come up to his life. And there are two broad methods again of delineating the character. One is by showing or by telling. By showing is by showing, that means a character is in actually in a motion. He is in a dramatic method in which a writer reveals a character indirectly through action and dialogue, and the reader is free to make his own assessment. In the other method of telling, the writer tells directly about the character and explains his motivation and disposition. More often, most writers resort to both the methods to effectively bring out all the aspects of their characters. So this is a one about character having different kinds of emotions. Most of the time, they show different emotions, which is very much relatable to a lot of audience, and sometimes not many of the audience. That's the reason why most of the characters the audience. Coming to the narrative technique, how narration takes place, what technique is involved in the narration, how does one tell a story. Now there is no single way one can be telling a story. It can be narrated in several different ways. If you focus on R.S. he says that there are three ways of narrating a story. Either there is a writer who has a plot in the mind and he chooses suitable characters to develop the plot, or he has a character in mind and invents situations and incidents to further plan out his plot. Now, thirdly, an author has certain atmosphere in mind and selects characters and plot to create a design which helps him to realize his instinct, what he's capable of. We can say, but then that the narrative technique actually means the perspective that an author chooses through which he reaches his readers to, and or the way he wants to present a character or an action or an atmosphere or a point of view. In all these aspects, the technique is to um, express the perspective of it. So, narrative technique, broadly, if you understand, it is divided into two categories, the first person narrative and the third person narrative. In the first person narrative, the narrator is a character who tells the story from his point of view. It makes the story more credible and lifelike. It gives the story a personal touch. You feel that you are the one who is already listening or reading it. Also, the reader comes really close to the narrator in a manner. He believes he or she understands the narrator better, as if is he himself is participating in the happenings. So this form of narration enhances intimacy and approximation. um, it feels like both the reader is also a part of um, reader is also a part of whatever is happening. Now there is a third person narration, and it has a broader outreach. In this form, the narrator stands outside the story. He can be the omniscient presence who can be all knowing and all seeing, as well as he can walk in and out of any situation. He can have access to thoughts, psychology, and motivation of the characters. And then there is an intrusive narrator can comment on a situation, observe a situation, analyze psychology as well as enlighten the reader with his own knowing wisdom. The comments of any omniscient narrator have authorial authority, whereas an intrusive narrator will tell, a non-intrusive narrator will show characters in actions without any explanatory interpolations. Because an omniscient narrator remains at a distance, he can be more objective. So he can be seen. So it can be seen that because he's at a distance, the third person narrator is expansive or all inclusive, whereas the person of view of the first person narrative becomes limited because of his closeness and immediacy. So after narrative technique, we talk about the tone. So Rushali, what do you like before we move to tone? What do you like? Do you like first person narrative kind of technique, or a third person narrative kind of a technique?
Ma'am, I like the first person kind of technique.
Okay.
Judging.
Why do you think? Have you known why do you like it? What makes you so relatable?
Because, ma'am, I think I connect more with the first person, the POV of the protagonist.
Hmm.
This we get to know about. So,
Okay. Okay. Okay.
like more
Hmm.
relatable.
Okay. 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 Fine. Then we move to the after plot, character, narrative technique. We move to tone now. Now, what is a tone? Tone can be defined as because look, there is a catch here. Like tone, when we speak, we can understand the tone of a person, but when we write and when a reader is reading it, he or she cannot really understand the tone in a way, the way a person might be using it while speaking. So in writing, tone is generally the attitude or the manner in which the writer expresses the opinions or whatever he would want to express. Now, every story has a distinct tone or a style which might vary as per the certainty or the uncertainty of the situation or the attitude of the writer. So, the tone here can be defined as the attitude part. It can be sometimes ionic, it can be didactic, it can be a serious tone based on a situation. It can keep on changing. It can be comic, it can be formal, informal, it can be rude, it can be arrogant, uh, can be intimidating, can be just anything. It can be also sympathetic in nature. Overall, uh, the combination of different human emotions which help frame a person's attitude, that is expressed in writing in a story, so that becomes the tone of the writer. And it can really convey exactly what emotion the writer is right now carrying. The tone actually guides a reader's response about the intentions also of the writer. For example, a writer's attitude towards women or a class of society can be easily identified by the tone he uses in describing such a matter. So you can easily understand whether a writer is positive about, let's say, example, women empowerment, or he's negative about it. By the way he describes, or by the tone, we understand what kind of an attitude he is carrying. So that is a tone. And there is a high chance sometimes the readers also connect with the writer based on their own attitude. Sometimes that also happens. That is something under tone. Then we come to talk about the language. Definitely, language is the tool. The words are the tools through which the writers write their speak, give their opinion. The way he uses words is what distinguishes the writer. The effective use of words, the use of apt phrases, the telling expression, which is not just like any common expression any common person will speak in day to day life. Rather, the apt phrases, the kind of a words, a kind of words woven into uh, describing something, which gives an overall impression about the beauty and substance of somebody's writing. That is what language is all about. They use imagery, they use metaphors, they use different kinds of literary devices. They use alliteration, allegory, personification. There is hyperbole. There is lot of things. Simile. They can use symbolism. So that exactly tells about the depth of the knowledge the writer has, and how he or she is expressing that in a few suitable words. So that is what language is all about. And it helps also create a deep impact in the mind of the reader, by yeah, understanding more about the writer and the situation. So also these literary devices, they help the perception of how the writer wants to be received, on what he wants to convey. That is also very clear through the language, use of language. It adds beauty and fineness to his presentation. Sometimes language alone can entice and excite the readers, irrespective of whatever may be the character or the situation. Sometimes you are so, you may not really like the plot, you may not really like a character, but if the language is presented in a refined manner, you definitely would want to read more of the story or the novel. The subtle use of these devices enable the writer to control the response of the reader. There can be use of formal language, there can be use of informal language. Some writers use slang, some writers use dialect, they introduce new elements of realism, and depending on the situation or the character, language can keep on changing. The writer also introduces dialogues to provide dramatic intensity to a story, or he may also use monologue to provide psychological insight. So, depending on the situation, they can use the language accordingly. Now, this was language. The last part is setting and atmosphere, or the context. The locale, the background, or the geography in which the story is set lends reality and credibility to a story. That is also important, because your setting is mostly based on the culture that you come from. The background context is very important, where the story has taken place, what was the atmosphere then. So the setting also helps in creating an atmosphere relevant to the theme and narration of the story. Background details, which is in a story, are important element. A tale, let's say, set in the 21st century, may start with an email or an SMS message, because it is a 21st century. If there was a context where the story starts, let's say, more than 1,000 years ago, then maybe there was no email messages, maybe more of words used by the or the diagrams, or the pictures used by the stones or engraved on the wall. That kind of a message was set, because if it is 1,000 years ago or more than that. Supposing you are showing a rural background, and then you are introducing a high tech world, so in that way, that will not create an appropriate atmosphere, because you are talking about a rural background and you are using some really high technical world of metropolis and other things, so it may not create an atmosphere. So it is so important that you need to check with the background and the characters or the plot, or generally what happens in that particular culture or that particular era. Accordingly, a story has been set. Now, talking about an example, another example, there is a famous story, Panch Parmeshwar, which is set in a village with rural ambience, in order to create an atmosphere of verisimilitude. Now, historical stories will have appropriate setting. Periodic atmosphere will have a different kind of a setting. So, all these setting take place so that it will help to appear the story to be more in a realistic manner. Let's say romantic story will be set in an atmosphere which encourages soft feelings and other sentiments. So, accordingly, the modern short story, however, has been moving from the categorizations. Modern stories has been not depending on such kind of a categorization. The singleness of effect, brevity, and economy, they are no more the hallmark of the short story. There are stories whose appeal lies in the interplay of several modes. Then there are stories in which the point of crisis may not be overtly achieved, it may just be hinted at. Even the sequencing of the story, that is, having a beginning, a middle, or an end, has been subverted. So that has been changing modern short story. Chekhov, the famous Russian short story writer, he says, I think that when one has finished writing a short story, one should delete the beginning and the end, so what remains is virtually a plotless narration. In fact, in the hands of the modern writer, the short story defies clear cut definition. However, but for all practical purposes, singleness of effect, brevity, economy, plot, and the moment of crisis remain the essentials of the short story. And you should not forget the importance of these principles in evaluating a short story. So, this was all about setting and atmosphere. Now, we move to 21.3, Unit 21.3, where we talk about the short story in Canada. Let us understand how short story developed in Canada. Short story has have a long history in Canada, making a slow start around the 1830s with the stories of Thomas Chandler Halliburton. It picked up in the mid 19th century when newspapers and magazines gave a fillip to its publication. Interestingly, many of the early short story writers were women. For example, Susanna Moody, Rosanna Lefrohon, they were all early writers known for romances. Sarah Genoit Duncan's, she is inclined towards more about social issues. Social issues, and let's say Mary Agnes Fleming, they were all also most very prolific writers. And it was only in 1880s that for the first time a few collections of short stories made their appearance. The birth of Canada, specifically in a genre called the animal story, took place about the end of the century with the publication of G.D. Robards, Earth's Enigmas, A Book of Animal and Nature Life, and E.T. Seton's Wild Animals. I have known Margaret Atwood writing the introduction to the Oxford Book of Canadian Short Stories in English, and then other books also and other writers also. Beginning of the 20th century saw the publication of an important and a very popular collection of stories, Stephen Leacock's Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town, which consisted of a series of stories connected above all by the setting of a fictional town called Mariposa. uh, Morley Callaghan, who became a very influential figure in the development of modern short story in Canada, had two of his collections published in 1929 1936, namely Native Argosy and Now That Troubles Here and Other Stories. Depression and the Second World War brought a lull in the growth of short story. Although stories were being published, no collection worth its name got published till 1960s. Sinclair Ross, who was a novelist of repute, also wrote short stories about life in Manitoba, which were published in 30s and 40s. But his collection of stories, The Lamp at Noon and other stories, was published only in 1968. Similarly, Ethel's Wilson's stories were published in the 30s, but her first collection, Mrs. Golightly and Other Stories, appeared only in 1961. The reason for the late publication of such stories, if you have noticed, could be lack of enthusiasm for short stories as well as the and also the non-availability of periodicals and magazines interested in publishing them. Period after Second World War saw a spurt in the publication of short stories, and important post-war anthology was Desmond Passy, a book of Canadian stories, which had stories by P.K. Page, Sinclair Ross, Morley Callaghan, Ethel Wilson, and W. O. Mitchell, to name a few. The year 1959 is an important milestone in the development of short story in Canada. The CBC commissioned a weekly literary radio program, Anthology, which was dedicated to the broadcast of short stories. In the introduction to Canadian short fiction, from myth to modern, W.H. New writes, Weaver commissioned stories and helped develop subsequent prize story competitions, and in print form he also produced several anthologies and helped found the influential quarterly. In the 1950s it was assumed in Canada as well as in the US that short story anthologies would not sell, but things changed in the 60s. Robert Weaver, writing in the Oxford Companion to Canadian Literature, comments two major commercial publishing houses, Maclelland and Stewart and Macmillan of Canada, have had numerous short story writers on their lists. Um, Canadian short story have been more often than not a tool in the hands of the regional writers who recreate life in a particular locale, yet have achieved a great deal of sophistication as well as international recognition. Northrop Fire, the celebrated Canadian critic, commented that as cultures mature, they tend to become more regional. He says, I think the country we know as Canada will, in a foreseeable future, be a federation of regions culturally rather than a single nation. Um, the contemporary Canadian short story is a mosaic woven out of many strands. It left behind the sentimentality of romance and confronted life and society head on. According to W.H. New, the writers looked at life not so say, straight on as straight out, insisting that their readers stop avoiding the politics of the life they lived and sometimes only pretended to enjoy. During the 1970s and 1980s, violence and terror and anger were to become even more traumatic and debilitating as they were for the characters of Richards, Blaze, and Bharati Mukherjee. And yet, developments did not mean that reality was without comedy, that humor was impossible. But the two do not exclude each other. Indeed, what came to be characteristics of the writing all these decades was an ability to control the apparent disparities between literary order and social chaos. Coming back to Canadian short story, which is more or less no different from the short stories written in the world or all over. And as it happens elsewhere, it also focuses either on a tiny speck of time or larger slice of life. It is elaborately plotted or maybe plotless, may follow the established norms of story writing or break the pattern, may be moved in the 19th century society or reflect modern sensibilities and issues. In short, the range and variety in Canadian short story is limitless. However, when the Canadian short story is considered as a body of work, certain common strands can be found. The short story, which becomes distinctive on the basis of geography, history, people, culture, politics. The problems, on the other hand, may be universal, but the setting, atmosphere, and language may be cultural specific. No author worth his salt can ignore these factors, and these factors do not influence his psyche and imagination. So, certain Canada specific features recur time and again, such as the vastness and the bleakness of the land, the hostile terrain, snow covered wilderness, features that were prominent in earlier stories. The contemporary stories reflect a different scenario. focus shifted from landscape to mindscape. Now, summing up the Unit 21, we understood that the genre, what can be the genre of short story? There is a story in the basic impulse of man, how telling of tales and anecdotes was in due course transformed into writing about them in the form of short story. A 19th century short fiction developed as a distinct literary form in the several parts of the world. Main elements we talked about is plot, characterization, narrative technique, tone, language, setting, and atmosphere. And then we talked about the essence of Canadian short story, which has been more than that, to about the tool in the hands of regional writers who recreate life in a particular locale, yet have received a great deal of sophistication as well as international recognition. Important questions here for this unit can be difference between short story and a novel. What can be the first set of principles of a short story by Edgar Allan Poe? What are some of the basic elements of a short story? How is the modern short story different from that of earlier short stories? And what has been the impact of regional writers on the Canadian short story? Now we move to Unit 21, and this is about a mother in India, the short story. It is written by Sarah Janet Duncan, and in this unit, we talk about the introduction of Mother in India, about the life and works of Sarah Janet Duncan. Then we talk about a mother in India, the critical analysis, assessment, and theme characterization, narrative technique, and then we discuss important questions. Let's start here. This is Unit 22, Mother in India, written by Sarah Jeanette Duncan. This is set in the backdrop of British India. This is Duncan, who portrays the existence of the Anglo Indian women and their struggle for survival against the conventional world, which annihilates ambition and distrusts individual's potential. The same thing, although it is in the backdrop of British India, and still today we can see how the conventional world generally annihilates ambition and distrusts individual potential. This reminds me of one of the book, individual versus tradition versus individual talent. The same kind of the philosophy. Okay, so Duncan found the Anglo-Indian set of Calcutta and Shimla impossibly stuffy. So still, she had no difficulty with the lot of Indians and the ethics of imperialism. What she did question was the cost of the individual Anglo of sustaining the sterile and artificial facade of British order on the fringes of the empire. Her whole experience in India becomes tinged with the regret for the loss of a more gratifying life abroad and for the waste of a youth, energies, and talent in a cultural desert. The protagonist of the story, a mother in India, is very close to Duncan's own outlook and experience, her own frustrations and disillusionment. A mother in this story is forced to send her infant daughter back to England because the daughter had fallen ill and the parents were very poor. After 4 years of separation, when the mother goes back to England and the daughter is unable to recognize the mother not only gets rattled but also becomes angry. When the daughter becomes 21 years old, the parents come to take her back to India. The mother feels no fond instincts for her daughter and, in fact, treats her almost as an adversary. The plot takes us back and forth between India and England. The mother too is sure about her daughter's incapacity for her feelings, finer feelings, totally misreads and misunderstands her, is unable to appreciate her in any way, and appears just to be doing her social duty towards the daughter. She breaks the relationship between her male friend and her daughter, only to find the daughter decides to remain unmarried and devote her time to care for her parents. The daughter would remain with them for the rest of the time, and for this, ironically, one must blame the British India. Two discourses seem to exist here: her personal story and the Anglo Indian collective history, the responsibilities of being an imperialist wife, the no less binding dictates of Anglo Indian social customs, and the flinty, uncharitable individual personality of Mrs. Farnham all seem to be implicated in the development of the story. Um, Duncan holds the circumstances responsible for the situation, and behind the facade of being a victim, one senses definite Anglo Indian instincts of being self centered and superior. This was the thing about the story introduction. Let's start with the introduction of the writer, Sarah Jeanette Duncan. We'll talk about her life and her own works. She was born of Celtic stock and raised in Brantford. Sarah Jeanette Duncan attended Toronto Normal School but soon abandoned teaching to take up journalism. The career provided certain unconventional opportunities for travel, and as early as 1884, she was in New Orleans working as a freelance contributor for the Washington Post. Through the 1880s, using the pseudonym Garth Grafton, she was also a columnist of the Globe, the Week, and the Montreal Star. A trip around the world in 1888, her sketches of her travels appeared in fictional form as a social departure, led her to her meeting Everard Coates, a museum official in Calcutta, who went on to become a newspaper editor. While in India, Duncan wrote nine book sets. In India, two novels dealing with Canada and Canadians, and five novels dealing with the theme of Atlantic Triangle. The fact that the Canadian Duncan wrote only two Canadian novels and nine books that deal with India goes to prove that India loomed large on her imagination. Duncan reserves her praise for the Anglo Indian community who weather all the storms in India yet are misunderstood in England. Whenever the British are compared with the Canadians, they come as a second best. However, when compared to Indians, they emerge as far superior. She is not enamored of the British in England but becomes their staunch defender in India. Now, this approach suggests that Duncan's consciousness was vertically divided. She looks at the Canadian British relationship with one kind of a spectacle and the Indo British relationship with another kind. Her psyche is afflicted with double vision. Consequently, she uses double standards, one for Canada, the other for India, vis-a-vis England. Thus, she can be considered as another Anglo-Indian writer. Some of her novels are Burnt Offering, Set in Authority, His Royal Happiness, Those Delightful Americans. So we can take a break here for 10 minutes and we can come back exactly at 5:08, and then we begin with the critical assessment of or the detailed analysis of the story. So we can take a break now. And
Correct.
we're starting with Canadian short story. I have completed at least 21.1, where we talked about the Canadian story, the essence of short stories. And right now we are continuing with 22.2, which is Mother in India, written by Sarah Jeanette Duncan. We have done with the introduction part and the life and works. We are going to talk about the detailed analysis of the Mother in India, the short story. So let's begin. Um, if you take a bit of Mother in India, it deals with the unique problem of a mother who reunites with her daughter after 21 years but feels no maternal instincts. It is a position which would do any modern feminist proud, though it was written at the turn of the century. It is a rare case where a woman at the beginning of 20th century bold enough to state her stand, which goes contrary to the established and expected social conventions. Even today, we are not used to reading about mothers refusing to accept their maternal responsibilities in the name of personal independence. For example, Helena Farham, who has sent her daughter to England, becomes the Farhams were poor because the Farhams were poor, and right at the beginning of the story, one gets a feeling that Cecily, a character, is an unwanted child. But we know that it was an abnormal situation not to love her a great deal. A mother cannot do this way, and not to love her a great deal. More than life, immediately and increasingly, we apply ourselves honestly to it. The lack of spontaneity and attempt at propriety is glimpsed when the mother tells, "We were in such terror, not so much of failing in our duty towards her as towards the ideal standard of mankind. When she was just 5 weeks old, Cecily had fallen so sick that she had been sent to England." Now, Sarah Duncan had given birth to a child in 1900 at the age of 37. Unfortunately, the child died within days of the birth. Perhaps this late pregnancy had embarrassed Duncan and influenced the maternal ambivalence she displays when she comments, "Since an unfortunate infant must be brought into the world and sent and set adrift." Coming back to the story, Mrs. Farham proposes to meet her daughter after 4 years, and surprisingly, the milk of motherly affection flows in abundance. Perhaps the intervening period has thawed and mellowed her. Her 4 motherless years brought compunction to heart and tears to eyes. She should have all the compensation that could be. Her days and nights, as the ship crept on, were full of a long ache to possess her. The defrauded tenderness of the last 4 years rose up in her and sometimes caught at her throat. As she cried, she felt proud. After all, she is her mother. The reunion takes place at last. The unforgettable picture of a little girl unlike anything one can ever imagine, starting bravely to trot across the room. Halfway she comes, and she stopped with a wail of terror at the strange faces and runs straight back to the outstretched arms of her aunt Emma. The mother strangely reacts as if she had been slapped, as if she had been denied what was her due. Her expectations explode on her face. Although she says the most natural thing in the world, no doubt, but her real feelings describe on later that there is a lot of insecurity or insincerity in this statement. If this is the most natural thing in the world, then why should the mother sit down as a spectator, aloof and silent, impassive, looking at the alleged baby breaking her heart at the sight of her mother. It is not amusing even now to remember the anger that she has felt. It did not touch her or speak to her. She did not touch her, not speak to her. She simply sat observing her alien possession. The fear of the child is understandable, but the peak the mother displays is astonishing. What exactly has the child done to make her angry? And what exactly has Mrs. Farhan done as a mother? Done as a mother, that is also it is astonishing to see what when she's asked to kiss the daughter as she lay asleep, her reply that she did not think she could take such an advantage of her suggests not only a deep hurt but also that the milk of motherly love and kindness has suddenly dried up. I spent an approving, unnatural week in my farcical character, building my resentment and hiding my mortification with pretty phrases. I may have been Cecily's mother in theory, but I was John's wife in fact. To choose between husband and wife was the tragic lot of these women, and they knew that they would have to fail either as a wife or as a mother. Helena's angry response is very immature, setting aside the mother daughter relationship. If we look at the situation from the point of view of an adult child relationship, Helena's reaction cannot be accepted as natural or mature. In one of the article written by Simon Vauthier, Sarah Zinot Duncan's a mother in India asked the question. The fiction explores various possibilities of a mother-daughter relationship, and in the last analysis interrogates us: Are we to regard Mrs. Farham, who lacks the motherly instinct, as an aberration of nature, or a woman more or less typical of a certain kind of mother who, for varying reasons, has not acquired the experience of nurturing? The test makes a straightforward answer difficult. It is certain that she fails to act as a mature adult. In this context, it is an aberration. Helena's anger and her going into a shell suggest a feeling of insecurity. She feels she has been rejected by the daughter. But is Helena competing for attention? This egocentric turn can best be explained from the colonial angle. The mother is the center of authority, a centrifugal force, which is a typical colonial attitude. The daughter's crying is taken as a rejection, which hits at Helena's colonial mentality, and her exaggerated reaction verges on being petty. The obsession with the self is a typical colonial trait. The colonial knows now to reject others. They can't cope with the after effect of rejection. Helena emerges from this encounter as more of a colonial and less of a mother. When Cecily is 21 years old, Helena and her husband come to take their daughter back to India. On the voyage back, Helena comes across her old friend Decres Tottenham. When she introduces Cecily to him, he is amazed. He comments how Helena had never mentioned her daughter, as if she were a skeleton in the closet. De Crez notices Helena's indifference towards Cecily and comments on the lack of sympathy the mother shows towards her daughter. My dear boy, replies Helena, I have seen her twice in 21 years. You see, I have always stuck with John. But between mother and daughter, I may be old fashioned, but I had an idea that there was an instinct that might be dependent on. Probably, retorts Helena, men are very slow in changing their philosophy about women. I fancy their idea of the maternal relation is firmest fixed of all. Dacre's insistence that Cecily deserves some sympathy, gets the ultimate reply from Helena. I find the young lady very tolerable, very creditable, very nice. I find the relation atrocious. I would like to break the relation into pieces and throw it into the sea. One grows fastidious at 40. New intimacies are only possible then on basis of temperament. How awfully rough on the girl, opines Decres, to which Helena's answer is, that consideration has also occurred to me, though I have perhaps been even more struck by its converse. Although Helena confesses she hardly knows Cecily, yet she is too sure in her assessment of her and predicts confidently. She was the kind of a young person to marry a type and be typically happy. She watches Decres courting Cecily with amused detachment, as once again she is sure that Decres has more sense than to fall in love with Cecily due to compassion. Then the detachment gives way to alarm. She is sure that this union cannot succeed because Decris is too fine a person and Cecily lacks an appreciation of finer things. The story ends ironically in a final reversal of roles. Cecily, who has refused to marry, is permanently staying with her parents, is mothering her mother, an emotion she has never received but instinctively possesses. The irony of the reversal is one of the ways in which the text seems structurally to criticize the protagonist while hinting at the complexity of the mother daughter relationship. But as the title suggests, the story is not simple or like an individual case in the history. It was common for the Anglo Indians to send their children to England, which often led to the emotional dislocation the story explores. It was the socio-economic pressure that had initially led the Farhams to send their daughter to England. The inherent tragedy of an English mother in India cannot also be ignored. Now, if you focus on the theme of this story, Mother in India, it deals with a unique problem of a mother who reunites with her daughter after 21 years but feels no maternal instinct. Setting is British India. Now, such problems were peculiar for that time as some of the Britishers considered themselves to be exiled in India. The Anglo Indian female writers made it a point to emphasize the stress under which the females lived and the sacrifices they had to make while living in India. The dichotomy between the role of a wife and a mother in exile and the attendant problems forms the background. The Anglo Indian female wanted to oppose the picture painted by Kipling of English Mem Sahib in India, who, according to them, was a helpless victim of circumstances who deserved sympathy, understanding, and pity rather than scorn. The protagonist of the story, the mother, somehow does not deserve pity in A Mother in India because our heart, in fact, goes out for the daughter at the receiving end. In fact, you will notice even Duncan's attitude towards the mother is ambivalent. Helena is portrayed as a true colonial who wants to remain at the center of authority. The daughter's rejection surprisingly breeds a sense of insecurity in her, as the colonials were not used to being rejected. Helena emerges from this encounter as more of a colonial and less of a mother. Characterization, if we talk about, there are two major characters seen. One is Helena Farham, and the mother and the daughter is Cecily. Mother is the narrator, and the story is told from her point of view. She is a typical colonial character, self centered, overbearing, too sure of herself, and wallowing in self pity. Duncan is ambivalent in her attitude towards Helena. On the other hand, she looks at Helena as a suffering colonial who is a victim of circumstances, who has braved some very hard times initially to bring up the daughter, and for the daughter's sake, she is sent to England. On the other hand, Helena does not show the usual motherly instinct, is too hard and harsh on her daughter, and shows a total lack of consideration and sympathy. If we talk about the characterization of Cecily, the daughter is very sketchy. She grows up in England among the spinster's aunts, never knew the loan and the care of her mother, and when at 21 is asked to go with her parents, whom even she does not know, to India, she very obediently agrees. On the ship, Helena's friend Decres find her attractive, but the mother doesn't like it. She is a very restrained and a passive as a person, does not show much of self confidence. Though towards the end, she surprises us by deciding not to marry. Now, what is surprising here is because the narrator, her mother had prepared the readers to believe the worst in her. She's simple and predictable, but that does not make her the moron the mother wants us to believe. It only shows that the mother, as a narrator, is not dependable. Helena says with conviction that Cecily was a kind of a young person to marry a type and be typically happy. If one treats one daughter as a rival, her responses would tend to become biased and undependable. So, Cecily is not exactly what is supposed to be in her mother's eyes. True, she is simple and passive, but she is also a charming and caring person, capable of thinking of herself and taking independent decisions. The narrative style here, the narrative technique is written in the form of first person narration, and the incidents from the point of view of the narrator, who is the protagonist of the story. Interestingly, the narrator is also not very dependable. She is not an objective observer of the scene, as she is very much involved in the action, which more or less revolves around her. We get a biased picture of scenes and characters. She's especially true of the daughter who is painted in a negative manner. The narrator begins with a sense of superiority and a spirit of nonchalance, which is due course changes to a sense of alarm and anger. Duncan is ionic as well as ambivalent towards the narrator, but the balance ultimately tilts in the favor of the daughter, who is not the demon she is supposed to be. If the daughter turns out to be likable and reasonable, charming and normal, then it puts a question mark on the narrator and her point of view. So the rest of the description is adequate, nothing exceptional or extraordinary in the narration. India hovers the background and does not come in the forefront. Some of the important question for this particular unit is the character sketch of Helena Farham, and particularly, who do you sympathize more? If I may ask all of you, who do you sympathize more, the mother or the daughter? Who do you sympathize more? Is it the mother or the daughter? Yeah? What would be your answer? Okay, so let's start with Unit 23. This is Sunday afternoon, and it is written by Alice Monroe. Where is the voice coming from? Rudy Weeb. So, in this particular unit, we talk about the introduction of Sunday afternoon. We do a critical assessment. We talk about the characterization, again, the narrative technique, and accordingly, we also talk about where is the voice coming from. Similarly, critical assessment, theme, and characterization. So, by Sunday Afternoon, as an introduction, is written by Alice Munro, deals with the problems and vulnerability of women in the modern society. Women have been the focus of Munro's work, and in her very popular work, Lives of Girls and Women, she examines the process of growing up from a feminine perspective. Life is not easy for women, especially for those who are placed at the lower end of the social ladder. Present story talks about the condition of Alva, a maid in a rich household, how she is ignored yet is important enough to be exploited. Her life is contrasted with that of the rich. She has no hope, no future, only a drudgery of existence. And if she has to go up to social ladder, she would be willing to oblige. Howsoever advanced the society may consider itself to be, the basic human instinct, or should we say the male instinct, remains the same. A low class woman is not worthy of any attention except as an object of sex. The story, in a way, deals with the subject of a man woman relationship, but at a different level. It focuses on the vulnerability as well as a self awakening of a woman, or rather a girl. There is not much action in the story. The account of the drab existence of a maid is spiced with a physical description of things and people, minutely observing and colorfully presented. So let's start with the story of Sunday Afternoon. Let's understand how is this particular topic, Sunday Afternoon. Why is it like mentioned? Or what is so special about Sunday Afternoon? So let's talk about it. Um, the story Sunday Afternoon deals with the subject of man woman relationship, but at a different level. It focuses on the vulnerability and the self awakening of woman. Alva, the maid in Gannett house hold, is taken for granted. Wearing ill fitting clothes, living amongst discarded furniture, she leads a mechanical life without any expectations. Aware of the difference between herself and the guests that fill the Gannett house on Sunday afternoons, she doles out drinks and food till a cousin of Mrs. Gannett walks to her nonchalantly and kisses her passionately. Suddenly, Alva becomes confident, realizing that after all, there is not that much difference between her and them. But then, has the difference been bridged, or has she been used just as an object of sex? This ambivalence lends a fascinating peculiarity to the ending. So, a party is going on basically at the Gannett house on Sunday afternoon. Mrs. Gannett comes into the kitchen to inspect things where Alva, the maid, is washing glasses. Alma notes that the guests were the usual people. She had seen most of them before, although she had been working with Mrs. Gannett only for 3 weeks. There was a Mrs. Gannett brother and his wife, the Vances and the Fredericks, and Mrs. Gannett parents had also come for a short while, bringing with them a young nephew or cousin who stayed back when they went home. Alva found Mrs. Gannett cranky and aloof, as a woman in Alva's own family would have been with a maid. When Mrs. Gannett told Alva that lunch should be led, instead of saying, "Yes, madam," she said, "All right." Alva was not rude, but a country high school girl couldn't be expected to have manners of a trained maid. Alva was still quite clumsy in her work and used to admire the elegance and superiority of Mrs. Gannett's demeanor. Filling themselves with food and drinks, people would become excited as well as relaxed. But it was not allowed for Alva to show a little relaxation or excitement. Of course, she was not drinking except from the bottom of the glasses when they were brought back. But the feeling of unreality, of alternate apathy and recklessness became very strong in the house by the middle of the afternoon. Alva would compare the large, spacious rooms of the house with her own small, overcrowded rooms. She also felt a bit out of touch and reality. As she carried the dishes, Alva wanted to look presentable before the high society guests. The guests would carry their dessert plates and coffee cups back to kitchen. Mrs. Vance praised the potato salad, and Mrs. Vance, quite drunk, just kept repeating, "Lovely, lovely." He stood right behind Alva at the sink, so very close she felt his breath quite touch her. Going up north, Alba, up to Georgian Bay, Mr. Vance said, and Mrs. Vance said, "Oh, you will love it. The Gannets have a lovely place." And Mr. Vance said, "Get some sun on you up there, oh." And then they went away. Mr. Gannett felt concerned about Alva. He felt a responsibility for her and seriously asked her whether she was getting enough to eat. Alva reassured him, flushing with annoyance. Was she a heifer? She said she was going to the den to get some book to read. Mr. Gannett, trying to be helpful, asked her which book would she like, and Alva, in order to impress him, asked for King Lear. She thought a man would be more impressed by King Lear than a woman. Nothing could make a difference to Mrs. Gannett. A maid was a maid after all. The difference between the male and the female attitude is a major area of attention here that Monroe looked at this aspect. And then while washing glasses, suddenly Alva felt heavy and tired and uncaring and lonely. And it was other people's life that was coming to her mind again and again. Nothing much for her here is there. And then something happens. Mrs. Gannett's cousin came to the kitchen to hand over his glass. He stayed on in the kitchen. She waited her back to the counter, and Mrs. Gannett's cousin took hold of her lightly, as in a familiar game, and spent some time kissing her mouth. This was most unexpected but not unwelcome. The stranger's touch had cased her. Her body was simply grateful and expectant, and she felt a lightness and confidence she had not known in this house. So there were things she had not taken into account about herself, about them, and ways of living with them that were also not so unreal. She would not mind thinking of the island now. She saw it differently now. For the first time in a long time, Alva felt wanted, in some sense, equal to them. The kiss has changed her whole attitude, has given her confidence and identity. But the sentence of the story, which gives a further twist to the situation by introducing an element of doubt. But things always came together. There was something she would not explore yet, a tender spot, a new and a still mysterious humiliation. Has a difference between really bridged, or has she been used just for as an object of sex, to be used and dropped later on? Alva is not dwelling on this aspect yet, but this ambivalence lends a fascinating peculiarity and uncertainty to the ending. Talking about the theme, the story deals with the process of growing up of a girl and the problems she faces in the unequal world. Story is written from a female's perspective, and there is vulnerability, there is self awakening of a maid, and who is ignored most of the time. She leads a mechanical life. There is no more hope left. There is she's also not a trained maid, and the feeling of unreality is being seen. And she's compared this world with her own. She also felt a bit out of touch with reality. A characterization here, Alva is completely pictured as a neglected girl, one amongst many who work in the houses of rich people to make a living. She is different, she is awestruck, she is unhappy with her situations. Um, in between her work, she suffered about bouts of tiredness, heaviness, and loneliness in other people's life. Nothing much of her, and then the incident occurs and changes her thinking completely. She suddenly felt confident, light, excited, and full of hope. So the world, in fact, does not change in this way. So Alva, after all, is immature, ignorant of the ways of the world. That is what Monroe wants to warn about her. Technically, the narration is spoken in the form of a third person narrative. This form of narration gives the author a lot of freedom to go back and forth and be an omniscient presence. Author in this form is able to objectively analyze the characters and situations, help to and guide the reader's response. Now, um, next one under the same unit 23 is another book which is called as Where is the Voice Coming From? This is written by Rudy Webb. And the story about Rudy Webb is it begins by presenting a problem before us, and the problem is to make a story. It is very difficult to make a story from bits and pieces of information. It is more like making a jigsaw puzzle and trying to fit in different pieces of information till it presents a complete and comprehensive picture. This is 23, unit 23.6, and this is where we are talking about another short story. Where is the voice coming from? So, the story is 75 years old, and Vibi, the writer, does not know where or how to begin. Sometimes it would seem that it would be enough, perhaps more than enough, to hear the names only. And such fascinating names at that: the grandfather, one arrow, the mother spotted calf, the father sounding sky, the wife pale face, the cousin going up to the sky, the brother-in-law Dublin. Then there are the names of the police and the other important government officials. In this manner, Wibby very cleverly introduces all the dramatic persona. He ends the list with, and of course, himself in the awkward proclamation named John Baptist, but otherwise known only as Almighty Voice.
खोला खोला
Okay, so the policemen he shot and killed are easily located in various cemeteries. The suggestions being made here is that of the memory of the bravery of the policemen, which has been clearly, carefully preserved, whereas there seems to be a deliberate attempt to obliterate and anything associated with Almighty Voice. The burial place of Dublin and going up to the sky is unknown, as is the grave of Almighty Voice. With this bit of information, we come to know that Almighty Voice was not alone in the stand against the police. All three warriors fought for the uh, Pitinaniwin fight as they were totally and completely outnumbered. It is said that a metis named Henry Smith lifted the latter's body from the pit in the bluff and gave it to Spotted Calf. VB is at this, it has his ionic best when he juxtaposes the Indian version with the official one. The place of burial is not, of course, of ultimate significance. A gravestone is always less evidence than a triangular piece of skull, provided it is large enough. Now, if you talk about the theme of the particular book, we tries to resurrect the lost past of native Indians in Canada. History does not record properly the exploitation and the humiliation of native Indians at the hands of white settlers. Vivi becomes the voice of the natives, their historian who would like to put the record straight. Using bits and pieces of information, he reconstructs history as seen from the point of view of natives. The main characterization, if we talk about the main character, is in the story is Almighty Voice. But more important than a simple character is the collective character of the people, of the natives. Weeby tries to recreate and restore a people who have vanished from the pages of history and from the memory of the modern generation. In the beginning of the story, when Weeby says he does not know from where to begin, he feels it may be more than enough to hear the names only, and such beautiful names such as one arrow spotted calf, sounding sky, pale face, going up to sky, and Dublin. Such fascinating names. Narrative technique is told through the third person's narrative. Third person narrator acts as a historian who is trying to recreate the past of a lost people, a vanished tribe, using whatever little data that is available. He records the past glory of the original inhabitants of Canada and in the process questions the veracity, reliability of the recorded history. Important questions for this unit can be, can you term Sunday afternoon as a story written from the feminist point of view? What can you comment on the ending of the story? Coming to Vibi's projection on the suppression of the natives adequately in where is voice coming from, discussing on that. What devices does Vibi use to question the official claims about Almighty Voice legend? And is there anything common between the two stories? If yes or no, whatever, discuss. The last part of the today's blog, Unit 24, and this is about um, two stories again: Swimming Lessons by Rohinton Mystery and The Door is Shut Behind Me by Uma Parameswaram. So we'll talk about the story about the first of the swimming lessons written by Rohinton Mystery. In swimming lessons, there is a narrator, that is Kersey Boyce, describes his life in Canada as well as connects with the past and his parents living in Bombay. The story begins with the narrator's encounter with an old invalid man living in his building who reminds the narrator of his own grandfather, another invalid. Both the old people were immobile and both found it difficult to pass their time. The Portuguese woman across the hall is the inquisitive type who disseminates information about people living in the building to anyone who will care to listen. She had informed the narrator that the old man's daughter was taking care of him. Narration of the story in Toronto is intersected by his parents' reaction in Bombay to his letters, and these reactions are given throughout, making it subtexted tag along with the main narrative. So the postman rings the bell for so long, and that the narrator's mother wanted to give him a piece of her mind, but she was afraid of the postman's vengeance because after Shiv Sena agitation about Maharashtra, for Maharashtrians, bus drivers, conductors, and such other workers were at their worst behavior. But when she saw the letter from Canada from her son, she gave him some baksheesh and kissed the envelope and ran to her to tell her husband. He told her not to get excited because he knew the kind of letters he wrote, a few lines of empty words. When the mother read the letter, her enthusiasm vanished. The letter described the weather more than anything else. The father commented, everything about his life is locked in silence and secrecy. The narrative shifts back to present to Toronto. Two women were sunbathing on the stretch of a patchy lawn. Both look luscious and gleaming, and the narrator fantasizes about their bodies. He runs down to have a closer look at them and finds, to his disappointment, wrinkled skin, aging hands, sagging bottoms. He goes for his first swimming lesson. When he had gone for registration, the woman at the desk asked him, is swimming not encouraged in India? On the contrary, most Indians swims like fish. Only he is an exception, replies the narrator. Then he remembers how he failed to learn swimming because the deep blue sea of Chopati beach was grey and murky with garbage, too filthy to swim in. So it was a mixed class, but the gorgeous woman of his fantasy was missing. He has to settle for a 35-year-old woman wearing a pink one piece suit with brown hair and a bit of a stomach. The instructor Ron gives them pep talk and demonstrates floating on back. Then he asks for a volunteer. The pink one piece suit waits forward. So this goes on, and while the best thing is the mother in the story was about in the story was about the the grandpa. Now, how she had told her son to get the blessings of the elders. So that was one thing which has been shown about the mother. There is a talk about the winter in this place called Toronto, and this goes on and on. The theme, the story deals with the problems of adjustment and acceptability for migrants. The immigrants living in their adopted country face a typical dilemma about their sense of belonging, and mystery portrays the superficial existence of the immigrants who live in Canada without actually knowing the Canadians. The tension between wanting to belong and wanting to retain one's identity is the number one theme of this complete story. The characterization is revolving around four characters. There are two. There are a protagonist who is a narrator, an old invalid man in Toronto, and the narrator parents in Bombay. The technique of the story is written in first person narrative form, yet is unique and quite interesting. Taking you to the last story for today. This is The Door I Shut Behind Me, written by Uma Parameswaram. And there is this myth called as Trishanku. He was a king who wanted to go to heaven with his body. He performed tapasya and got a boon to fulfill his wish, but nobody can go to heaven with his body. It is only the soul that goes beyond the physical realm. So when he was on his way up, he was stopped midway by the god above. He was also not allowed to go up, and he could not go down, so he kept hanging in the sky. He was neither in the heavens nor on earth. So Trishanku is one who is neither here nor there. He does not belong anywhere. This is the symbol or the theme that Uma Parishwaram uses to describe the immigrants. They neither belong fully to the country of their adoption nor can they forget their roots, links with their mother country. This is the dilemma that the writer Uma Parishwaram projects in this story. About the door I shut behind me, it's mostly about um, an immigrant who deals with crossing over for good. However, there is this. Uh, it is not a bride who is leaving her home, but an Indian leaving his country to become a possible immigrant in Canada. This simile is very apt as both the situations involve crossing over to a new life. The story opens with Shandar, the protagonist, who is flying to Canada on a 2 year research associateship with the University of M at an annual salary of $8,500. The exact amount of salary has been specifically mentioned to focus on the fact that those going abroad are usually lured by money and the attendant comforts. And then, as the plane clears the clouds, Sander focuses on the book on his hand, the Ramayana his mother had given him at the airport, along with another book for Bhagavad Gita. So the story develops through contrast everything about Agarwal, who is an insensitive to his old loudness and Chandra's discomfort, waxed more friendly and voluble. Returned to his seat. Agarwal, the co-passenger, returned to his seat. His criticism continued. Our toilet habits are much cleaner. These Westerners, the same trend of criticism was carried through the meal. Thus, the story develops through contrast. Everything about Agarwal revolves Chandor, his dress, his North Indian accent, his egoism, his shallow generalizations, and many more. In this manner, we come to know much about Agarwal and about Chandler. And in fact, we also come to know about Agarwal. They go the it's mostly about the talk between the two in the flight, and We also realize that Sander and talks to Agarwal because he wanted to be with his own people, to speak his own language. He suggests that Agarwal should look for more names common in his part of the country in the telephone directory so that he can connect to them and talk with them. Now, the theme of the story is about the immigrants' dilemma. The ambivalence of their situation is poignantly brought by Parmeshwaram. There are at times between the devil and the deep sea, whichever way they decide, some element of regret remains embedded in their situation. Characterizations are basically built around two contrasting characters, Shandar and Agarwal, who represent two different altitudes, attitudes, and ideologies. Agarwal is insensitive and loud, uncouth and irrational, whereas Shandar is respectable and rational. Agarwal epitomizes a class of Indians who criticizes the West and its culture, yet wants to stay abroad to earn money. Everything about Agarwal is reversed. Now, when we know about Shandar, it's about uh, more about how Chandar is becoming aware of his own inadequacy gradually as he move ahead as an immigrant in a different country. The narrative technique here is about a third person narrator, and the narration is quite simple and straightforward. Now, if you want to conclude between the two, swimming lessons and the door I shut behind me deals with Indian immigrants in Canada, both the stories. Whereas in swimming lessons, the protagonist tries to come up to grips with the conflicting cultures of India and Canada and becomes aware of the problems of an immigrant through other experiences. Swimming lessons points towards a strange and a superficial existence living together without knowing each other. But in the door I shut behind me, the protagonist is unable to coexist with his own countrymen. He feels alienated from Indians already settled in Canada as he finds them shallow and irrational. Important questions which can come to your mind is narrative technique of swimming lessons. Why is learning swimming so important for the protagonist? Contrast the characterization of the attitudes of Chandar and Agrawal and Chandar's views on Indians as expressed in his outburst. And do you agree that immigrants lead a Trishankul-like existence outside their country? So with this, we complete block 6. This is Canadian short story. We meet again, I think, on Monday, 4 to 6 again. And we'll start with block 7. Thank you. Have a good evening.